Hi, my name's Ruben Burke. I'm the chair of the WFDF Ultimate Rules Subcommittee. And I'm just trying something a bit different here this year for the update to the rules of Ultimate for 2021 to 2024. And I thought I would just walk you through some of the changes. So I've got a track changes version open here, as you can see. And I'm just going to walk you through and tell you about some of the changes as we move through the document so that those who are interested can hear about some of the changes and some of the reasons behind those changes as we look through the document. I'll aim to put a timestamp in the video so that you can jump to particular sections if there's something you do want to look at. But otherwise, I'm just going to walk you through the rules, and hopefully this is useful for people who are interested in finding out more about some of the changes we made for 2021 to 2024. And so first off, one of the key changes is shifting to actually make it from 2021 to 2024. Previously, you might recall they were just the rules of Ultimate 2017 and 2013, and before that 2009. We have had a pattern, as you can tell across that, of just updating the rules every 4 years. And so we were kind of just formalising that, but also realising that sometimes it was a bit confusing when we were in 2020 and what rules we're using. We're using the 2017 rules. And so we thought, well, if we make it, say, 2021 to 2024, if you're in 2023, you know what rules you use 21 to 24. So that's why we've brought about that change. It was something that we took from USAU. They did a similar thing with their rules, so we've done that here for our rules. You might also notice, if you're observant, we've included a little logo up here for the World Flying Disc Federation as part of the new document. So scrolling through here, we come across some of our first key changes. Well, I guess keys are an overstatement there, but we've got some changes here. The important one here we've got is around, we've changed the word self-refereed to self-officiated. And this is not a huge change, but this is just in response to the recent change that was made to the WFDF bylaws. It was specifically referring to Ultimate remaining as a self-officiated sport. So we thought it was appropriate to just update that language there. Means the same thing. There's no change to any of the way we actually do things, but it's just keeping the language consistent between across all of WFDF. You can see there we've also got another update here around how you can vary things that used to be in another part of the rules in a kind of specific sense around field size and length of game and those sorts of things. But we've shifted that out if you just have it in the introduction so that people are mindful that they can adjust certain elements of the rules to accommodate special competitions, and also flagging that we do have the appendix which spells out some of the specific changes that we make for WFDF events. And so that's that change. Moving down then into 1.1, we've got just again that switch from self-refereed to self-officiated. Here we have what I would say is actually a key change, and that is the introduction of this rule here at 1.2.1. And so as you can see in 1.2, we've always assumed that players will not intentionally break the rules, and therefore we don't have a method within the rules for dealing with deliberate breaches of the rules. But whilst I think that's the right approach to take, to assume that people won't breach the rules, it meant that if people did happen to breach the rules, there was actually no way of allowing players to remedy that. They'd have to go outside of the rules to address that. So all we've done here is enabled that captains can come together and work out what they think is the right outcome to address these deliberate or egregious breaches that might occur, even if that outcome is not in accordance with a specific rule. And one example to give you there to kind of maybe crystallize what this is all about is if there is a dangerous play in the end zone. So if a player has caught the disc, they're in the process of catching the disc. They haven't yet caught the disc, because if it's a strip, that's a different story. But they're in the process of catching the disc. They're going to catch a goal, and someone just, maybe they've lost their mind for a little moment, and they've bumped into this person and completely taken them out. Like, it's clearly a foul. They jump up, they really apologise, but it's an egregious foul in the end zone. But the player had not caught the disc, so it's not a strip. And so what that would mean, if you just follow strictly the rules, it would mean that it's not a goal. It would mean that the player would have to take the disc after the disc is checked into the goal line and then try and throw the pass to score the goal. So what we're saying here is that if it is this kind of a dangerous play, it is a deliberate or egregious breach. So that's where the dangerous play element comes into it. If it's an excessively dangerous play, the captain's going to come in and say, yeah, look, perhaps even the captain of the team that committed the offence could say, yeah, really sorry about that. We're happy to just let you have a goal for that. And so that's what this rule is about, is to allow captains to have those conversations and kind of just make a sensible outcome based on dealing with those egregious breaches, rather than us having to try and spell out through the rules what you should do if there are egregious breaches, because the whole premise of the rules is that there will not be egregious breaches. So we're hoping there still is not egregious breaches or deliberate breaches, but we're just allowing that mechanism to address them if they do come up. Scrolling down the page here, you'll see that within the spirit section, there's a few additional rules, clarifications we made, just some new comments. So one of those here around considering their opponent's viewpoints, using respectful language and words and body language. This has come directly from USAU, and that'll be a common theme. It is an important thing for us, both USAU and WFDF, to kind of bring our rule sets together where possible. There are some things where we still have a difference. There are some new differences we've actually implemented through what we're doing, and that's kind of that ongoing process that I think both groups are undertaking to continue to try and improve the rules. But where there's no good reason why there's a difference, we're trying to make them the same. And so there's no real good reason why we'd have different wording around what good spirit is. And so we've included their wording there, and that was actually after they'd included many of our wordings around what good spirit is within their most recent update. So that's where that change comes about. We have added in though here at 1.4, as well as ensuring that we're talking about, following the agreed upon rules, the basic joy of play, we've added in player safety as an important thing also to be mindful of. There in 1.5, you'll see, and throughout the rest of the section 1, we've just changed spirit to have a capital S. So very important we're mindful of that. I mean, that's a kind of a glib comment, but spirit is really important, and so we've got that there capitalized to make sure it does give that prominence. 1.5.1, we've shifted just an update to reflect some of the previous changes we made, where we said retracting a call wasn't necessarily about where you think that a call was unnecessary. It's more that it was not correct, and so that's why I've adjusted that wording. 1.5.2 matches with the USAU update. 1.6.2, there you can see that's just a common language usage there. We don't necessarily talk about, you'll see it used to previously say violations, and so we're saying breaches, because that describes more things than just a violation. That includes any breach of the rules. Again, we've added in the other win at all cost behaviour, matching the USAU. Here at 1.7.2, this used to say discipline players who display poor spirit. And I realise it's not really the responsibility of one team to discipline other team members about their bad spirit. So it's about disciplining your teammates. And hopefully if both teams do that, then the players who are showing poor spirit will be disciplined in that regard, at least, put in check and said, that's not how we do things. And so that's an important thing to have within the rules. And also there, 1.7.3, provide constructive feedback when teams are doing things well, not just when they need to improve. And that again comes across from USAU. And we've just brought across to make it really clear that spirit stoppages also apply to the broad set of the rules. They've been in the appendix for quite some time, but they weren't expressly stated within the rules of ultimate. So we've just made sure that we've got spirit stoppages in there, and the best way to find out the details about the spirit stoppage is still within the appendix. 1.8 there, just a slight tweak here, and this previously used to talk about if a novice player commits a breach, that you can help them out. But it didn't really say that if they're on the receiving end that you can kind of help them out. And really that's what we want. We want if there's a player's involved in any way in some sort of breach and they don't know what's going on, other experienced players should come along and help them out. And so we've just made it really clear in that language that there's not some specific carved out reason when you can or cannot help out a novice player. You can always help out a novice player as part of that. 1.10, we've just shifted the language there. So we used to say that rules should be interpreted by the players directly involved in the play. And really what we mean is that the calls should be discussed by the players. So we've adjusted that language there. It's not about how we interpret the rules. It's about having a discussion about the call, and that should involve, that can involve understanding the rules. That's part of that discussion, but it should be by the players involved or by players who had the best perspective. And by players who had the best perspective. We've made that shift there as well. that we have shifted. This section here used to be up higher up within the spirit section. We've actually moved it down within this element of 1.10 because it directly relates to this item. So we do say that calls should be discussed by the players directly involved, and by people who had the best perspective. But we also say then that if you were not directly involved, but you think your teammates made the wrong call, then you should step in. You can't just say, oh, well, I think they've made the wrong call, but because I wasn't directly involved or because I didn't have best perspective, I won't get involved. That's not a kind of a way of getting out of your responsibility to inform your teammate they've done something wrong. So that's why we've brought that down to just kind of connect in with that rule 1.10. And then 1.10.2, we've just said players may seek other people's perspectives to clarify the rules. Used to just say non-players, but it's not just about non-players. It could be other players. You could seek their perspective to clarify the rules as well. So just really within our language, it's always a constant process of just tweaking and adjusting and making sure it really means what we want it to mean, making sure there's no ambiguity about what it means. And we're still going to have some ambiguity. Unfortunately, there's still begin some confusion, but it's just part of that process of continually trying to update and adjust, and based on feedback, based on different interpretations, just try and get them as clear as possible. 1.11 there, we've said that players and captains, we've shifted that to being solely responsible for making and resolving all calls. I think that was always kind of implied within that it was about resolving the calls as well, but we've just been explicit there. And in 1.12, we've shifted the rules there. It used to say, or it is unclear. We've just used that terminology, not clear and obvious. And that's a term used in other sporting fields, just, kind of give that sense that if it's not clear and obvious, it's not like, yeah, obviously, that's what happened. This is the agreed upon thing that occurred. Then those are the instances where you can just send the disc back to the thrower. It doesn't have to be a case of you disagree with another person that they're totally wrong. It could just be that it wasn't clear and obvious. And so that's, we think, useful language to have in those parts of those discussions. Moving through here, I'm not necessarily going over every single change we've made, but I'll touch on the key things here. 2.5, this is, I guess, a fairly minor shift here, just to talk about the brick marks, not specifically referring to a specific length. And this just enables us when we are adapting the rules, so using it for beach, using it for indoor, whatever the case might be, that these rules are as easily applicable to other types of ultimate as possible. And so by saying not giving a specific length for the brick mark, just giving it in comparison to other parts of the field, that makes it easier to translate that across to other formats of ultimate. Coming through here, you see no change to 3, no change to 4. 5 here, we've just got an indication of a spirit captain, put that within there. And so that's important to kind of highlight the significance of that spirit captain role to make sure it actually is embedded with the rules of ultimate. Scrolling down then towards the pool, we just provided some clarity there. I wish to say in terms of who was actually doing the pull, that we had a receiving team, we had a pulling team. They're just the offense and the defense. So we've just made it much more clear that we're talking about the offense and the defense. Here's another one of those key changes, and this is at 7.5, and this is in terms of what you do after there has been an offside called. So within the main rules of ultimate, it used to just be a repull. And then within the appendix, we had a whole lot of specific other things that would occur for an offside. We updated in 2020 in terms of what those outcomes were to have the outcomes we've got here now. And we thought it was appropriate to bring those across into the main rules of ultimate because we didn't see there was a need to have a difference between WFDF events and what was happening in general ultimate in terms of offside. And so what occurs now, that if the defense chooses to call offside, so it's not, you don't have to call offside, but the defense does choose to call offside, what happens for the offense is that they catch the pull or don't catch the pull, let it land, whatever it is, but they can't drop it. If they drop it, it's still a turnover. You can see there in the end of 7.5, we said that 7.8 still applies, and 7.8 is dropped pull. So for example, let's just say the pull was going deep into so it goes out of bounds, lands, rolls and goes out of bounds. So it's landed in bounds and then rolled out of bounds. And so the thrower can pick that up and they would walk to the part of the sideline of the playing field where they would be putting the disc into play. And without the offside call, they could just put their foot down and then start play. But because they've been called for offside, what happens is they get to that point and they have to stop. And the rest of the offense has to then set up as if there was a timeout called at that spot. So, you'll set up in a stack, whatever it might be. You'll have your dump. Everyone will be positioned as offense. And then the defense gets their opportunity, as they would after a timeout, to set up based on the positioning of the offense. And then you check the disc in and you start to play. So basically what that means is that because the offense has gone offside, they don't get the luxury of being able to take advantage of that. That might have enabled them to move more freely up the field and to gain better yardage, get a position, and move the disc more quickly. And so as a result of being offside, what that means is they have to start play with a checked disc after the defense is set up. On the other side of that, if the offense chooses to call offside against the defense, so the defense has gone across the goal line prior to the pull, or the thrower has stepped across that line as they've gone to pull, what happens there is that the offense can call offside. They have to do so with both instances before the offense actually touches the disc, and they can't catch the pull. So you can't catch it if you're going to be implementing offside as offense. So you call offside, and regardless of where the disc is going, you let it hit the ground. Once it hit the ground, you can pick it up and treat it like a brick. And so you can just move up, put your foot on the brick mark, and start play. No check is required there. So really what we're saying there is that if the defense has gone offside, it's as if they've done a bad pull. And what do you do when there's a bad pull? Well, that results in a brick. And so that's the way we're trying to allow you to resume play there. As with both of those, it is the choice of the team to call that. So if it was actually a really bad pull and they don't want to take it as a brick, they can just not call offside. And so then they don't have to worry about having to go to the brick mark. Moving down again there, we've got 7.7. Just got, in terms of the terminology there, we've got the disc hits the ground. And this is just an opportunity to, and you'll see this throughout the rules there, just bring into that consistent use of language. Sometimes we would say the disc contacts the ground. Sometimes we'd say disc hits the ground. Now we're saying disc hits the ground, and within the official annotations, we've got a kind of a description of what that really means. But it's just that no one is touching it, no one's in control of the disc, and it's hit the ground. 7.8, we've got here just this idea of offense fails to establish possession of the disc, and that's going to be to do with a change I'm going to talk about a bit later on, where we've introduced a difference between catch and possession. But I'll flag that when we get to that. But that's why this change is here, and similarly there in 7.9. In both those instances, that's the reason why we've changed that language. You'll also see throughout these next sections, many occasions here, we've again been trying to be more consistent and concise with our language. And so we refer to a pivot point and a pivot location and a pivot. To pivot is the thing you do when you have a foot down and you move your body around, keeping that point still, that pivot. And so that's the action of pivot. And then the pivot point is where you're actually pivoting from, that spot that you're using to pivot. And we also have that terminology pivot location, and that's where you either have your pivot or you're supposed to establish your pivot based on a rule. So that's just used throughout here. We've tried to be more consistent with that language and more precise with that language so that that's easier to understand what we're talking about. And that applies through all those changes through there. Moving on now to section 8, and you'll see that we've shifted now. Previously, this used to be called state of the disc, and we've just shifted that language to say state of play. And it was just kind of a bit of an odd terminology to say that the disc was dead and that the disc was live. And so instead of that language, we're saying that play is dead or play is live. Play is live kind of makes sense, and the opposite of that is going to be play is dead. And some of these changes, it really is about ensuring that if we've got people where English isn't their first language, that we're trying to make this as clear and easy to understand as possible without using phrases that might seem fairly obvious within English that aren't necessarily as obvious when you translate them across or come from English not being a first language. So that's why we've had that shift throughout the document. 8.1.2, this was just a shift to get better clarity. It was always, there was a bit of uncertainty about whether or not after the pull or after the turnover, the disc must be carried, applied to both those things. but it does apply to both those things. So we've just shifted the language there to more easily convey that. 8.1.4, there was a bit of a kind of a grey area within the rules. It was not something that people were confused about, but when you tried to look for a specific part of the rules to help you understand this, it didn't really exist. So this is just this idea that if the disc has hit the ground, so there's been a turnover, the thrower's thrown it, it's hit the ground, it's rolling along the ground, and then the defense, or the team who was on defense, now the new offense, are going to pick it up, and as they go to pick it up, they don't quite establish possession of it. They kind of fumble it trying to pick it up, but never quite establish possession. That's not a double turnover. It's until you actually have it. Then if you drop it after that, that's a different story. And so that's why we're saying, just got that rule in there. Same applies to the pool. When the pool lands and it's rolling along, if you're just trying to grab that and you happen to fumble it as you're grabbing it, that's also not a turnover because play is dead. And just clarifying there at 8.1.5, players are allowed to move during dead play unless there's a specific reason why otherwise. There was sometimes confusion about whether you could move at certain times during play being dead, but just to be clear, unless we specifically say you can't, I can't actually at the top of my head think of when the reasons why you might not be able to. Possibly I just guess prior to a check might be one of those instances. After a call of some sort, so after a call is probably a good example because after a call it stops play until the desk is checked in. So there are times there that you can't move, but otherwise you're free to move, especially after a turnover. When you're walking the disc to a particular spot, people are free to be moving around while you do that. And again, 8.2 and 8.3, just to reflect that change the definition around play is live and disc is live and dead. We've got a few pivot points there that you can see. Shifting down here to 8.5, just had a kind of little structural change there to assist to make things more easy. Real people who have got a really fine eye for detail might notice that in the previous rules, there was an inconsistency between the little hyphen we had at 8.5.1.1 and 8.5.1.2, but thankfully someone pointed that out and we fixed it up, so now that hyphen is consistent between 8.5.1.1 and 8.5.1.2. If you do ever find issues with the rules, I do appreciate it, so please let me know. That was one of the more minor ones I've ever have come across, but let us know. We'll try and fix it up for the next version. The next one, though, that's more significant is around 8.5.2, and we've just added in this reference to a pre-stall, and that's detailed down in the definitions, but it's that idea of counting down. So if they had 20 seconds, you could say 20, and then at 15, you could say 15, at 10 seconds, you say 10, 5, and then that's just giving them a sense of how the count is going, so that then this rule 8.5.2 does apply. So that's part of the appendix. We just wanted to bring that small element of it within to the main rules of Ultimate. The next point here, 8.5.2.1, is something that a few people had previously had some concerns about. And I think, let me just make sure I bring the camera back up there for everybody. So 8.5.2.1, this was, there was a bit of an inconsistency. And it was a bit of a kind of strange rule previously, so we've kind of fixed it up now. And it used to say that the offense had to be within 3 meters. So this is changed in 2 different spots, so just bear with me while I make sure. I think that change I'm talking about is actually, let's just jump down here. I think that might actually apply down here at 10.6. Sorry, just looking through this. No, it was in here. Okay, so if we just look here, we said if after a warning the offense continues to breach those rule up there, the marker may commence the stall count. I'm pretty sure this is the part of the rule that used to say if the offense had to be within 3 meters of the pivot point to be able to do that, and we've just removed that element of it. So sorry for the confusion there. I think maybe we've had trouble with the track changes as part of this, but just to be clear, that the marker can commence the stall count as long as they're within 3 meters of where they're supposed to be, regardless of where the offence is. So you can't just have the offence being miles away, and therefore that doesn't mean you can start the stall count, because that didn't really make any sense and didn't match with the appendix. So that is a change we've made there, despite the track changes not necessarily showing that. So again, I apologise for that. Section 9, we'll see there that we've got just a little change. We've made it in a few places throughout the rules, is that we've removed any sense of, when we talk about something may have had to be audible or verbally, we've just talked about communicated, because there might be people who are not able to do it verbally, or verbally might not assist them based on whatever the case may be. And so we've removed the need for it to be audible. It just has to be communicated. In other cases, we talk about noticeable or clearly. And so it's up to the players to work out the ways they want to be able to do that. So we're not defining within the rules a certain way that it has to be that doesn't necessarily take into account the needs of everybody. So that's why that change has been made. 9.3.1, we've got a change in here that's specifically to do with matching up with USAU rule. And that's to do with that the marker can only start and continue a stall count when play is live, or until a pivot is established after a turnover. So there used to be this kind of strange kind of grey area, or just kind of conflict in the rules, that if you intercepted a pass out of bounds, right just over the sideline, the new marker couldn't start stalling you until you came back to the correct spot. Okay, because play was dead at that time. If we come back here to when play is dead, it was after a turnover until a pivot is established, that after it must be carried to a specific spot. But if you intercepted a pass just inside the sideline and then went out of bounds, they could start stalling you straight away. So that's no longer the case. You have to actually wait until they've established a pivot. And that also applies to them catching it while they're running. You have to actually wait until they stop running and establish a pivot before you can start stalling them after a turnover. 9.3.2, it's just a bit of a strange quirk we found there within the rules, that it used to say you had to be within 3 meters of the thrower to be the marker, not of the thrower's pivot point. And given that the thrower can move as they pivot from one side to the other, you could at one point be 3 meters from the thrower, and then as they pivot to a different spot, no longer be within 3 meters of the thrower, and that doesn't kind of make sense. And by referring directly to the pivot point, that makes it a much clearer idea of where you have to be 3 meters from, and also matches USAU. And then also if the thrower is not at that pivot location for whatever reason, maybe they've gone out of bounds, maybe they've travelled, then you just have to be within 3 meters of the pivot location. And then a similar matchup there in 9.4, just to talk about the 3 meter radius. You have to be within whatever that description we've given up in 9.3.2. Here at 9.5, we've got another key change, and this was again just around language, around clarity. Instead of referring to things as being contested and uncontested, which can sometimes be a bit similar, and I know that I've heard feedback from other countries that in terms of language that can be a bit too nuanced. And so we've changed the terminology of contested and accepted. And so hopefully that's a clear enough distinction from those two things. So that's not the negative to do with it. It's either accepted or it's contested. And so that's a change you'll see throughout the rules. 9.5.4, there is an addition here under 9.5.41 and 4.2. And that is around how do you resolve multiple calls? And this was something that the previous rules, we would have just said it was stall 6. But that wasn't always the fairest outcome. And we went through a whole different lot of scenarios to try and work out what we thought was the most appropriate outcome. And what we've deemed is that if there is a call involving the thrower, so the thrower throws it and there's a foul called between the thrower and the marker for whatever reason, and then there's also on the reception a foul called on that, and that might be contested or not contested. It can be kind of tricky to work out, well, if that's contested and this is not contested, where does the stall count go? And so what we've tried to make clear within this rule now is that if the disc is returned to the thrower to resolve that outcome, so you would resolve the receiving foul first, and we'll see a specific rule that covers that later on, but you resolve the receiving foul first, and if the result of that means that the disc is coming back to the thrower, then all you do is worry about the stall count involving the thrower, and that's the way you would resume play. 9.5.4.2. This is just to make really clear, and I think it was the thing that most people did anyway when they were playing, but just to make it really clear, is that if there is a violation called regarding the check, so let's say example, there's been a pick called, and the stall was previously on 8, right? And so now it goes back to maximum 6 because that's what 9.54 says there. And then prior to the check, so everyone's come back to their right spots and right, we're going to check the disc in. And before the disc is checked in, say for example, the defense moves too quickly. They move before the check, and so the violation's called. There's a violation, and so everyone returns back and they go, well, that was a violation by the defense, and they don't contest it. They admit they moved quickly, so now the stall count should be according to 9.5.1, stalling 1. But that's not the case, and it's not generally how people play. And so we're just really clear there that you ignore any impact on the stall count by that violation. It would just be whatever it was previously going to be resumed at, which, as we were given that example, was stalling 6. So that's just to make that really clear within the rules. 9.6, you'll see we've just added in reference there to, that's the timeout, and that's because we slightly changed the language there around when the stall count can come in after a timeout. Used to be maximum stalling 9. It used to be whatever it was up to. So if you were going to be coming in on 10, you would be stalling 10, which not a good place to call a timeout, but it could happen. And so now we've talked about what is the maximum. And so we talk about it there, and that's why we've just got that reference there. We'll go over that in more detail when we get to section 20. 9.6.1, just in terms of the last agreed number fully added prior to the call. So if someone was stalling really fast and going stalling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they can't say, well, got up to 5, so that's where I'm up to. You say, well, what was the last agreed legitimate kind of idea of it? And that's in the annotations, we clarify that too. But it's the number that the players can agree to of being the correct number. We also have within the annotation, for those who are interested in that sort of stuff, if there is actually a significant disagreement around one says it's coming in on stalling 3 is what I got to, the other says it's stalling 5 that we should be coming in on, as with some other places in the rules, when there is disagreement around that, you just split the difference and round down as part of that. But that's in the official annotations. Here in section 10, we've got just some slight change of wording there to add in completion of a timeout rather than just because of a timeout, and pull together the stoppages into one element there. Here we've got similar change around that catch possession issue that I'll touch on later. Fairly significant changes here around what we're dealing with the check. And we think there's previously been a bit of muddiness around how teams check the disc in and what happens in terms of trying to resolve a bad check, people moving before the check. Can you call it against your own team, that your own team checked it in before you were ready? Those sorts of things. And so we've tried to make that much clearer here within section 10. And so first off, we've said that you've got the onus is on you as the person checking the disc in, whether that's generally the thrower or the marker, to check that their own team is ready and that their own team is in the right spot. That's their responsibility to check their team is ready and good to go before they say, okay, let's check it in. So making really clear that that's where the onus is on the person checking the disc in, that they're responsible for making sure their team is ready. 10.5, we've just talked about, I've just clarified which was the team in terms of that delay, but also clarified that if you are enforcing this delay of game, and so you're trying to check the disc in before the other team is actually in the right spot because they've delayed potentially, you still have to be stationary. Now you have to be in the right spot before you can do that. So you can't just say, well, because they're in the wrong spot, we're going to be in the wrong spot too and moving, and it doesn't matter. That's not the way to do it according to the rules. You have to make sure that your team is correct if you are going to enforce that delay of game call at 10.5. Here, just clarify of language, and here we've got may. We try and use may instead of should. Well, it's either must or may. We try not to use should unless there's some good reason to. And here is where we just finish off that clarity around how you resolve those calls and when you can call a violation regarding the check. And so it's not if your teammate is in the wrong spot, your teammate was checked it in before you're ready. That's not grounds for calling a violation. It is only if someone tries to make a pass before there's a check. It is if you don't actually verify with your nearest opposition player that they're ready as per that rule there. If the opposition is moving immediately prior to the check, so obviously if they moved, and then they got to the right spot and then you checked it in, that's okay. It's about, immediately prior to the check, or they were not in the appropriate position. And so those are the times that you can call that violation. And after this is another significant change if there is a violation called regarding the check, the rule there says that play does not count regardless of whether it was complete or incomplete, and possession words back to the thrower. We've added in the addition there though that 16.3 does still apply. And 16.3 is the rule that talks about if something did not affect the play in any way, the call or the event, then you can just let the play stand. So if regardless of that movement before the check and the call of the violation, that turnover or completion was still going to happen, you can still allow it to occur. And so that's we've added that there because it used to not be an exemption within that. There used to be a specific rule here saying that you couldn't apply 16.3, but now it's saying that you can apply 16.3 there. Moving now to section 11, out of bounds. Just clarified that we're talking about the ground in terms of out of bounds. And then here we get to this point of time where I'll start talking about this issue to do with catch and possession. And I might actually jump down to section 12 and then I'll come back up to section 11 to talk more about that. But so section 12, what we've got here is we've kind of redefined catch and redefined established possession. Previously they used to be the same thing, and now we've said they're slightly different things. This should, in practice, have basically no impact on how people have been playing the game previously. This is really to kind of give some clarity and to match the ways people have been playing previously, and just to make the language more clear about how to address those things. And so a catch is now specifically defined as when a player has a non-spinning disc trapped between at least two body parts. And we go further detail in the annotations around what trapped actually means, which you can look that up if you want that detail. But a non-spinning disc, so non-spinning, that's a key part of it there, trapped between at least two body parts. And so there used to sometimes be debate about, is a disc resting on someone's leg after they've fallen over? Is that a catch? What's a catch? What's not a catch? This is really clear now that it has to actually be trapped between at least two body parts to be a catch. And that the catch then enables the player to establish possession of the disc. So previously catch involved this element of sustained. There was a time component to it. Before you had a catch, you had to have kind of trapped it and then had an extended period of time. That extended period of time element now sits within the definition of established possession. So to establish possession, you have to have a catch that you maintain for a noticeable amount of time, and you have to survive through any ground contact related to that, or have made a pass. And so that's what we've done there to just kind of hopefully make it really clear about the difference between those things. And one of the reasons why I'll highlight as I move back up here to section 11. So what we've got here in 11.3.2, and hopefully this will become clear as I describe it now, is that a player who has caught the disc, right? So you've trapped it within your fingers, for example, who contacts the playing field. So when you trapped it, you were touching the playing field, and then you've gone out of bounds, right? That's still in bounds, as long as you maintain the catch until you establish possession. So it's not that you have to have had control of it for an extended period of time before you go out of bounds. You can have it just for that one moment. As long as the same time you've caught it, you're touching the playing field, you can then go out of bounds and establish possession, and that's in bounds. And so that's one of the reasons why we've tried to clarify that language there. Another is to do with down, that we'll get to when we get to section 13, and the other is to do with strip, that we'll get to when we get to section 17. So if that player who's caught it does leave the field, they must come and establish the pivot point at the location where they cross the line, as per usual. And then also, just because that used to talk about thrower, here we've got a new line that specifically talks about a thrower who contacts an out-of-bounds area. And that's because you don't become the thrower until you establish possession. So there's this kind of new grey area between when you've caught it and when you establish possession, at which time you're not actually yet the thrower. So that's why there's a distinction between 11.3.2 and 11.3.3. So once you are the thrower and you're contacting out of bounds, you're still considered in bounds. So that's basically more comes back to the idea that you've established the disc in bounds. Maybe you've caught it in bounds and you haven't gone out of bounds at all yet, but you're near the sideline and then you pivot and your non-pivot foot goes out of bounds. That doesn't mean you're out of bounds. You're still in bounds, and that's what 11.3.3 is trying to cover. 11.4, we've got just an addition there of any part of the receiver is out of bounds, just to make it really clear that it's not just like the body of the receiver that has to be out of bounds. It's their shoe, it's their clothing, it's their hair. Any part of them out of bounds means that they're out of bounds. And then 11.4.2 was just to add a bit of clarity there that we really were talking about while they were airborne as part of that. We've got play instead of disc there. And then here at 11.6, we just got that reference to court because that's what we really mean when we talk about 11.6. Again, those location changes in terms of pivot and spot and point. So 12.1, I've covered in terms of what that first line means, in terms of what an actual catch is. And again, you should refer to the definitions and also the annotations for some more detail around that if you're after that. But then we still have that same caveat afterwards there, that if you fail to maintain the catch because of ground contact related to the catch, and we've added a bit of detail in the annotations as well about what that actually means related to the catch, which I encourage you to look up, or contact related to the catch with a teammate or a legitimately positioned opposition player, then possession is deemed to have not occurred. You still caught it, but you don't have possession. That your possession didn't occur. And that's important when we go and look at goal, that to have a goal, you have to establish possession. It's not just enough to have caught it, you have to also establish possession, but you have to catch it in the end zone. Doesn't matter where you establish possession after that, as long as you caught it within the end zone and you maintain the catch. That's another key part of this here, maintain the catch. So if you catch it and then you, whilst trying to land still, that you no longer are catching it and then you have to re-catch it, that catch starts again. So if you did have to absolutely, if you happen to catch it in the end zone and then as trying to establish possession, you then lose possession as you go into the central zone, for example, and then you actually catch it and then establish possession, that's not a goal because you didn't catch and establish possession afterwards from the same catch in the end zone. But I'll cover that some more when we get to section 14. And there's that clarification I was making previously around in section 11, that after establishing possession, the player becomes the thrower. So that's where that that's relation to 11.3.3. Again, here just a must instead of a should. We've added in here around 12.5, and I think this is an important clarification to be mindful of, is that, it has always been this sense that you are entitled to occupy any position on the field. You should be entitled to take that position and no one should contact you if you do take a legal position. But you've got to make sure that you're not doing so in a reckless or aggressive manner. So if you're running around with your eyes closed, you don't have freedom to just do whatever you want. If you're running around, waving your arms around like this, that doesn't mean you have a right to move, and anyone who gets in your way, that's their fault because they got in the way of your arms as you're moving like that. So that's why we've added that specific caveat there. And also just clarified around 12.5.1 that it is to do with making a play on the disc. If you're just running to go for the next pass afterwards, this idea of not being able to be impeded on purpose only applies if you're actually trying to make a play on the disc. If you're trying to make a play for the next play afterwards, you can be kind of intentionally blocked in your path by someone. 12.6, we've just added in, pretty much what we've done is we've brought in some of the language we had within the annotations. We thought it was really useful language, and we've brought that within this section 12 around positioning. And so we've added in this idea that the idea of avoiding contact includes avoiding and initiating contact with stationary opponent or an opponent's expected position based on established speed and direction. So it's just bringing in that language from the annotations into the official rules. 12.6.1, I think again is a really important element, and that's this idea that sometimes people, I think incorrectly, would sometimes get this sense that, if the disc is there and, I'm going to make a play for it and, I think I'm probably going to foul them, but it's worth it, to try and maybe get at disc and then we'll work out what happens afterwards. That no, if you're actually going to make a play and you don't think you're going to be able to do that legally, so you think, well, I'm going to make a play here, but it's going to be a foul, you should pull out. And if you do so, I've also seen instances where people said, well, I pulled out because it was going to be dangerous, so that's a dangerous play. That means that the disc will go back to the thrower or whatever the case might be. But if you've pulled out of the play to avoid yourself committing a dangerous play, then that doesn't apply. You just avoided a dangerous play, and that's great. That's well done, but the result of the play still stands. So that's why we've got that rule 12.6.1. 12.7, again, another important addition within this whole positioning section, is just really clarifying what we mean by initiate contact, because it wasn't clearly defined previously. We had some descriptions within the definitions and within the annotations, but we've again brought that into the main body of the rules, and there's those two elements here. It's around whether you arrived at the point of contact after the opponent, so clearly that means you got there first and then they've run into you, and that's either their stationary or moving opponent. That means that if you got there first, the person who comes in second, they're the ones who've initiated the contact. Bearing in mind, though, that as long as you can't just have got there first in a way that was always going to cause contact with that other opponent. And that's where 12.7.2 comes into effect. We've got minor here, and this is, I think, the first time we've come across that. And so this is a change we've brought in. We've kind of moved away from the term incidental contact to the term minor contact instead. And I might just jump down to the definitions there to talk you through that. So minor contact is a new term, and it does replace throughout the rules this idea of incidental contact. And incidental contact, if we look back at the track changes, that used to talk about any contact that was, what have we got here? I apologise, we've just lost the screen again, but that used to talk about any contact that was not dangerous in dangerous play, or that did not affect the play. That was kind of the language you use around what was incidental contact. And instead of that, we've now moved to this language of minor contact. And you can see the definition here, and it talks about contact that involves minimal physical force and does not alter the movements or position of another player. That's what we define as minor contact. And so minor contact, that can happen. It's not a foul. As you'll see later on the rules, if you deliberately initiate minor contact, and the classic example being a defender resting their arm on their opponent so they know where they are, that's minor contact, but it's deliberate, so that would be a violation as compared to a foul. There is an exclusion here within how we define minor contact, and that is that any contact with an opponent's arms or hands that are about to or already are contacting the disc, or contact to the thrower's hand during the throw motion is not minor contact. And so that type of contact is considered to be contact that we want to avoid because it will have an effect on the play. And so that's why we've specifically included that as not being minor contact. It does get a bit confusing here with all the not and minors and the nots, but hopefully when you read it in the context of the rules, it makes sense. But really what we're saying here is that there's a type of contact which we describe as minor contact that is not a foul. So you shouldn't call a foul just because there was minor contact. But there's then this other type of contact, non-minor contact, which is a foul, and regardless of what the outcome is, it's still a foul. And how you resolve that depends on how you use the continuation rule and those sorts of things. But it doesn't remove the fact that it was still a foul, even if the outcome of the play is going to stand. And that was one of the tricky things we had previously when we had affect the play within incidental contact. It became quite circular, the logic within there, and it became self-referential. And so that's one of the reasons we've removed that from there. So hopefully that makes sense, and I'll try and jump back up to where we were up here at section 12. So yeah, some minor contact can occur with that new definition, and that should be minimized, but is not considered a foul. 12.10, we've just added in the use of an object, and that's like, so if you, for example, if there's a wall nearby, and we had an incident this with indoor, if you use a wall to kind of jump off to try and get higher up, That's not allowed. That's using an object to physically assist you in contacting the disc. So that's not allowed. Take a break. If you've stuck with me this long, kudos to you. You've obviously got a keen interest in the rules, and appreciate that. And as I'll say this at the end as well, but if you do ever have questions about the rules, I'm always open and happy to try and answer questions people might have about the rules. So feel free to send me an email. You'll find my details on the rules.wfdf.sport website there at rules. The rules email goes straight to me. Here we have another one of those instances where the distinction between catch and possession is quite important. And this is in terms of what we define as the disc being down. And so the definition there at 13.1.1 is still in place, that the disc contacts the ground while it's not in possession of a defensive player. And recalling that possession is about a sense of time. You've had the disc for a period of time. You've sustained that control of that disc prior to the disc having gone to the ground. Whereas we know that that's not the case, that if you're diving to catch a disc, you lay out and you get it between your fingers and then the disc hits the ground and you maintain that's up. That's not down. You're able to grab it before it hit the ground, even if you didn't sustain that for an extended period of time, that control before you hit the ground. It's still up. And so that's why we've got catch here is a way of ensuring that it's not a down. So as the rule says here, however, if it is not down, if a receiver catches a pass before the disc contacts the ground and maintains the catch while the disc is in contact with the ground. So you have to maintain it while it's in contact with the ground. So if you do grab it just before it hits the ground and then it hits the ground and while it's touching the ground you lose your grip on it, then that's down. But if you're able to maintain that grip, lift it off the ground, and then you happen to let go of it, but you're able to regain possession, regain control of it, then we're not saying that somehow because you lost it after hitting the ground, that magically the disc was all of a sudden touching the ground previously. That's not the case. You're able to still regain possession because you had managed to trap it before it hit the ground, and you only lost that trap after the disc was no longer touching the ground. So that's the reason we've got that distinction in there. Again, we've talked about here in 13.1.2, interception is around establishing possession of a pass. That's when it becomes an interception. So if you catch it and then you hit the ground and you drop it, you never had possession. So it's just down rather than being an interception. The defense still gets the turnover. It's just not considered to be an interception. 13.1.3, just added in here that you can call out, as everyone does, not just out of bounds. 13.1.4, this is about the pull. I'm not talking about the receiving team, but offense, as we spoke about before, hits the ground. Again, that idea of catch compared to possession. Here we've just got accepted instead of uncontested. Here, this was just a mistake we made in the update for 2017, that we changed the definition of 13.25 to match the USAU rule in terms of you could touch the disc once it was in there, you just couldn't catch it, but we still have referred to it as a double touch, so that was wrong. So we finally been able to fix that and refer to it as a self-catch. And this change here just reflects that change we spoke about in 12.10. 13.3, just clarifying that play stops after there's a contest call. That was pretty clear and obvious, but just making sure it's actually within the rule that it's clear and obvious. 13.4, there's a few changes here, and this was just to provide a bit more clarity around stall outs. There was a bit of vagueness within the language previously, especially in terms of what happens when the thrower still has possession. And so we've got here new language saying that if the thrower still has possession after a stall out call, but they believe that it was a fast count, and that's why they couldn't, it was such a fast count that they couldn't call the fast count before that occurred. That's good reason to contest, to have that conversation around the stall out. And if it is contested, it's treated as a contested stall out. But if the if the marker says, yeah, sorry, I was way fast there, got excited and I counted too fast, and so it's not a stall out, that's an accepted breach by the defense, and so the stall count will go to 1. So basically it's a retracted stall out is what that is. And so that's what's going to be the impact of that. The next one there is what happens if you do make a completed pass. So you've thrown it, but the marker has said, no, I got to 10 before you threw it. and the pass is completed, the thrower can say, not only can they argue that and then say, well, no, I got it out before the T of 10, I'd already released it. They could say that, no, I mean, I did get it out after the 10, but that's because you were fast counting. You went 8, 9, 10. And so I got it out before the 10 would have occurred had you been counting properly. That's reasonable grounds to contest that stall out. Importantly, it's about the count prior to that. So if the marker, for example, counts very fast at the start, but then they realise and slow down and count properly at the end, you can't say, well, you've counted really fast at the very start. That's why I'm contesting it. It has to be the stall count just prior to the stall out, because if you were concerned about the stall out at the start, you should have called it at the start. You can't wait to the end and then call it. Coming down here to 13.6, this is just kind of covering more of our bases here around this rule, which is the rule that if you do have an interception and then you don't realise you're the one who's supposed to maintain possession of that after that, and you put it down on the ground, then that's not a double turnover. We say, well, in accordance with the main rules of Ultimate, that we try and say, well, what would have most likely happened had there been no breach? Well, you still would have had possession, and so you would regain possession. That also applies then to after a pull. So if the pull's landed on the ground rolling along and someone tries to just stop it and happens to pick it up and then put it down, that's not a turnover. They will just have to go and establish possession. And similarly, if instead of putting it down, they gave it, literally handed it to someone, that's also not a handover turnover. It comes back to them as part of that. 13.7.3 just really clarified there that it was the time of the call for which those issues there apply. Accepted instead of uncontested. A lot of these ones here just to do with that pivot point, the spot, the location, just cleaning up that language. That's all throughout here. 13.11.3, we've just, instead of saying failure to move, we've talked about the things we already spoke about up here in 13.11.1. By doing those things, you're determining where you're establishing the pivot and cannot be reversed. Here we are in 14, and I spoke about some of these things already, but I'll just kind of clarify again. This is where we talk about the catch and possession again. So it's a goal if you catch the pass, and when you catch it, you were entirely within the attacking end zone, or your ground contact, so your feet were in the end zone, for example. Or if you were airborne at the time you caught it, so you were jumping into the end zone, for example, the first thing that happens when you land has got to be within the attacking end zone. And, very importantly, and there, you subsequently establish possession of the disc and maintain the catch throughout all ground talk related to the catch. So after you've caught it in bounds, in the end zone, you've got to keep that catch until you establish possession. It doesn't matter where you end up establishing possession, as long as you had maintained that catch from being in the end zone to wherever you end up, through all ground contact related to the catch. And that relates back to those notes from 12.1 and 12.11 as they did previously. It's just in a slightly different format here. 14.2, again, this just that switch over from catch and possession not necessarily being synonymous. Here we've got a bunch of those things to do with pivot and point and a must, and those things just again give that clarity. And 14.4, just talking about the goal wasn't actually scored necessarily when they established possession. It's just deemed to have been scored when the player established possession. And this is really just to help out if there is a time cap issue that occurs, because with time cap, as we know, it's generally the case that you finish the point and add 1 to the highest score. And when do you finish the point? Is it when they actually caught the goal? Is it when they decided they caught the goal after a discussion? And this just makes clear that it's when they actually established that possession. So not only had they caught it, but they survived through that ground contact related to the catch. That's when the goal is deemed to have been caught. That's when the next point would start after that, regardless of any discussion that might have occurred to determine whether it was or was not a goal. Moving then along to section 15, we've again got that use of that term non-minor as compared to non-incidental, and I'll refer you to the definitions to better understand what we mean there by minor. But again, this really important clarification that if you are intentionally initiating that minor contact, so that minimal physical force that's not altering someone's position, that's still a breach of the rules. So you're still not allowed to do it, but it is just a violation, not a foul. So just being really clear, as I said earlier, that habit of defenders kind of resting their arm on their opponent to know where they are so they can get a sense of when they move or not, even without looking at them, that is a violation. That is not allowed within the rules of Ultimate, and this is the rule to refer to if that does come up. Moving down here to 15.5, this is another one of those significant adjustments, and this is to do with who can call a double team. So previously we had it in the 2017 rules that it was only the thrower that could call these sorts of marking infractions. But now we've said actually for the double team, we think it's appropriate for any offense player to call it, because sometimes the thrower's not aware that there's a double team happening. The thrower might be focused on one particular thing and not realize that this person has come across into their space and that they're not within 3 meters of another player. And so they're not able to call a double team, but it is occurring. And so by allowing offense players to call that double team, it makes the defense aware they're doing the wrong thing and hopefully adjust, but also alerts the thrower to the fact. And you don't have to get to that confusion of saying, oh, it doesn't count as a double team because the thrower didn't call it. Well, now it doesn't have to be the thrower who calls that double team. Scrolling down here now to 15.9, and this is again another one of these examples like we had with the check, where there used to be kind of potentially seen as an exemption around 16.3, and we're making very clearly here that there's not an exemption, that for this sort of call where they've made an incorrect call, an incorrect stoppage, that if that incorrect stoppage had no impact on anything, the result of the play should still stand. And we've also then specified how to address that in terms of the stall count, that the person who did stop playing correctly, it's deemed that they're the ones who committed an accepted breach. And so that will determine how you resolve the stall count. 15.10, just talking there in terms of when you can contest, it's not just because the foul or violation didn't occur. It could well be that because you don't think it was something that was had a meaningful impact. It might have been something you don't think was consistent throughout how the previous parts of the game had been called in accordance with the rules in Section 1. So those are the grounds for which you can contest, not just because you think it didn't occur. You might think, well, yeah, look, the breach did occur, but I think for these reasons, it's still not the right call. And so you'd want to give some good examples and good reasoning why you think that's the case, but it is allowable to have that conversation. And that can also include that you don't think it affected the play, and therefore, in accordance with how you should resolve the rules, that's what should occur. You think something should occur differently to what your opponent does. 15.11, again, we're saying that you can retract here any call, so that includes turnovers. It wasn't clear that you could retract a turnover. This is making it clear that you can retract a turnover, and again, a similar solution there in terms of how to resolve the stall count. Similar to when we spoke about the adjustment in the stall count, if there's been multiple calls, we have here this rule, which again we've adapted from USAU, that if there are multiple breaches, you resolve them in reverse sequence. So as I gave an example before, there's been a foul between the thrower and the marker, the disc has still been thrown, there's been a foul between the receivers, you resolve the last breach first, and the last breach was the receiving foul. Resolve that. If that ends up that the disc goes back to the thrower, then go back to the thrower and then resolve that element of it. And that's the way to manage that. And 15.1.3, just encouraging players to use the hand signals. Those are available in the appendix, and they were really fantastically updated last year. We had a really fantastic artist volunteer to update that, so that was really fantastic. And just want to make sure that within the rules we encourage people to actually update to use those hand signals. Sixteen and 20, moving through there, not that long to go, but we're getting up to some of the more important ones actually with 16 and 17 and 18. So here we go with section 16, and there's a few changes here to be aware of. We've just made sure that we're talking about any sort of stoppage there in 16.1. And then in 16.2, this little line in here might not seem like much, I guess, but it is, I think, quite a significant shift. And so 16.2.2, you'll see if we look at the track changes, it used to say is called when the thrower is in the act of throwing. And so what that meant was that if there was a pick called, you had to determine was the thrower in the act of throwing when the pick called, or was it before the act of throwing? And sometimes that was a kind of a bit of a fuzzy thing to work out exactly. And so by making this change here, we're saying it's only when it's the call is involving the thrower do we care about whether it was the act of throwing or not. If it's not involving the thrower, it's only whether the disc was in the air or not that makes a difference to whether or not 16.2.4 applies. So for the example of pick, as I was saying before, if there's a pick called and the disc was in the air when the pick was called, then play continues. If it's a turnover, then it's a turnover. There's no discussion about whether or not it should go back or not based on it affected or not. The pick was called while the disc was in the air, the turnover stands. If the pick was called while the thrower was in the act of throwing, it could still well be that the turnover stands, but that's not in accordance with 16.2.4, that's in accordance with 16.3. And so you'd have to have that conversation about, well, did the call affect the play? And so it could well be that if there was a pick called quite close to the thrower, and they go, oh, pick's been called, I should probably stop, but actually they were already committed, and they ended up throwing it, but they were half trying to throw, half trying to stop, which I've seen happen several times before, then that pick call itself did affect the play. Because, the thrower was trying to stop, they heard a call, but that affected their play. And so that's why we've made that shift. And hopefully it just makes it easier when we're trying to say, well, was it in the air? Was it not in the air? That's the question, not was it in the air or was it in the act of throwing or was it before the act of throwing? It's just in the air or not in the air. That's the distinction you need to make. As to whether or not 16.2.4 applies, as I said, 16.3 can still apply regardless, but that does take into account whether the call affected the play. 16.241, this is again to bring us in line with a shift that USAU made, where that play on call used to be kind of a voluntary kind of, just a nicety to make that play on call. Now you must call that play on if you want there not to be a stoppage. And that's the person who's actually who called the foul has to be the one who calls play on, and they should do that as soon as possible in terms of as soon as they realise that play should continue, not as soon as the foul occurs. It's once they realise that play can continue. But we do have an annotation specifically around this which says that if them not calling play on had no bearing on anything, like people just kept playing, that's not a reason to say stop, I'm going to stop the play just because they didn't say play on. If you're happy to just play on, then just play on. And that comes back to that ruling in the spirit of the game, whereas you should only make calls that have a meaningful difference on the impact of the game. If you did think, you weren't sure if play should continue or not continue and you'd stop genuinely and they hadn't said play on, then yes, you can call that violation and then they'll have to come back. The outcome of the play will still stand, but it will restart from once the outcome was determined. And then in 16.3, we've removed here the reference to foul or violation, and it's just any call, whatever it might be, regardless of when any call is made. If play continued after that and nothing was affected by that call or by the event, then the play should stand. And that's, I think, a pretty sound and reasonable outcome to have. And we've just made it really clear that there's no exemption to that. There's no having to worry about, but if this was happening and that was happening, then maybe that doesn't apply. This rule always applies, 16.3. If it didn't affect anything, let it stand. All right. This is tough work, sitting here talking like this for so long. I'm going to move then to section 17. And we've got some few key changes here. And this is to do with just how we describe dangerous play. We've again used some of the language from USAU. There's no clear reason why we would have a difference here. And so we have included their similar language. We've always had it as part of the rules that it was regardless of whether or when contact occurs, which is some of the USAU have come in line with that, and that's really good. But a specification here, though, that this rule is not superseded by any other foul rule. It used to confuse people sometimes because we had rule 16.3 that was never superseded and this rule that was never superseded, so how do they match up to one another? This is just saying that dangerous play is not superseded by any of these other foul rules down the bottom. So if there is a dangerous play, it's going to be a foul, regardless of what some of the other foul rules might say. And then we've got just clarified the language there around what to do if it's accepted or not. Here we have another significant change, and this is, if you've been following along what we did with the appendix last year for 2020, not really a significant change in that regard. But if you hadn't been following along, it might be seen as a significant change. But it's mostly in keeping with what we had in our annotations, but it's just making it really clear that this is the way we expect receiving fouls to be treated. And that is that, again, we've got that non-minor component here. Check in the definitions if you're not sure what minor means. But what we've got here now is this extra bit of a rule here, which is saying that if you contact the opponent's arms or their hands, right? So you just happen to hit their hands, and you do that after you'd already caught the disc. So if you're on defense and you get the block, and then you happen to hit just the hands or the arms of your opponent, that's not sufficient basis for a foul. So you can't call a receiving foul solely because you were waiting to catch the disc, someone dived, they caught it, and then they happened to hit your hands after they had caught the disc. You can't call a receiving foul on that unless it was dangerous. If what they were doing was dangerous, then yes, of course, like as we said before, that's not superseded by any other rule. So you can still call the foul on that and could be treated as a receiving foul as a result. Obviously, if that doesn't apply, if you've caught the disc and then someone hits your hands after you've already caught it, that's a strip, as we'll see down below. And so that's also excluded as part of that part there. But really what we're saying is that for it to be a receiving foul, if it's after the block, so if I get the block and then I bump shoulders with you and kind of cause you to kind of shift your position, so it's therefore not minor contact, that is grounds for a receiving foul. Because if you're entitled to be in that spot, the defense has to try and make their bid without, initiating that contact with you. But if you just happen to have reached your arms out at the last minute and they knock your arms after they've got the block, then that's not a receiving foul. So it's an important distinction to make, but it's not some free rein to mean you can just make any bid you want. You still have to be mindful of the rest of the body of the opponent, but arms and hands being hit is not sufficient basis for a foul to be called. And then in our next section there, 17.2.2, we just clarified the language around what happens, how you resolve these things in terms of what happens when there's a receiving foul in the end zone. And hopefully the language there is more clear for people. Also, as part of this, you'll notice that we've removed the distinction between offensive receiving fouls and defensive receiving fouls. They're just receiving fouls. They're treated the same. There is no difference within the rules. And so they're joined together here in the one rule set under receiving fouls. Strip fouls, what we've got here is a slight shift in the language, and it's around the caught the disc or to lose possession. And so that again relates to that distinction between catch and possession. And so if you catch the frisbee, you trap the frisbee between your hands, and then after you have it trapped, the disc is hit out of your hands. There's no need for it to have been a sustained contact or sustained control of that trapped disc. Having trapped it is enough grounds to say you stripped me if they hit the disc out, because as we'll see later down as well, once you have it trapped, that's considered part of your body. But also, obviously, if you have possession, the thrower's got the disc and someone hits it out of your hand, that's also a strip. And so that's why we've put that clarification in there. Importantly, and I think this is one of the rules that sometimes people get a bit confused about, it's not enough to have just be touching the frisbee to call a strip. You have to have actually have trapped it. You have to have, you're the one who's in control of that frisbee when they hit it out for it to be a strip. Just touching it and then they hit it out, that's good defense. That doesn't count as a strip. Blocking fouls, here all we've done really is actually bring in again some of that language that we included in section 12 around player positioning and that came from the previous annotations. Just brought that into the main body of the rules to give a bit more clarity around what we mean by blocking fouls, that it is about an opponent who's moving in a legal manner. So if they are moving in a reckless manner, this doesn't necessarily apply then. And that the reason that they're unable to avoid you is because they had their eyes closed and weren't looking. That's not therefore a blocking foul. That's the person who was moving around illegally, moving recklessly. They're the ones who are at fault in that regard. But also we've added that element of taking into account the opponent's expected position based on established speed and direction and that non-minor contact. Force out fouls. bit of an interesting shift here. We've just said that it's force out fouls don't only apply when someone's in the air. We can think of many actual examples where perhaps you were in the end zone and you were, waiting to catch the disc, and before you're able to catch the disc, you got fouled, and that, well, even actually, you got fouled, and that shifted you out of. You got fouled from behind, and that shifted you out of the end zone into the central zone, and you end up catching it still. So you've called a foul, but then you've caught the disc. Well, if you go back to section 16, that means basically just play on because you've still got possession. You've called a foul and you've got possession, so just play on. But actually, without that foul, you would have caught it in the end zone, so it would have been a goal. But you can't just have a foul mean that it's no longer a goal. And so that will mean that because you're in the process of establishing possession and you were forced out of the end zone, that means that it is can be considered a goal as a force out foul. Same applies to being moved from the playing field into the out of bounds. It's not just because you were airborne, you can also be force out fouled even if you had a point of ground contact. Defensive marking thrower fouls here. Again, just make sure we've got the terminology of non-minor. And talking specifically about the contact being with the illegally positioned defensive player. And the key example here is if there is a double team, you've got the marker who's marking you, they might be legally marking you, and then 2.9 meters away, there's an illegal defender. That doesn't mean that any contact between you and the marker is now a foul by the marker. Because they are legally positioned. They're not the ones who are illegally positioned. It's that additional defender who's come into that space. If you were in contact with them, then yes, that would qualify under 17.6.1.1. Moving down here to offensive throwing fouls, we've just clarified the language there around solely responsible for that contact. So that goes back to the idea up here that within 17.6.1.2, we're talking about both vying for the same position. So there's three elements here. There's contact that's only caused by movement of the defense. That's going to be a defensive foul. Contact that's caused only by the offense. That's going to be an offensive foul. Contact that's caused by both moving. Basically, that's a defense foul. So we just kind of close the loop on that. So that's why we've got solely responsible there within offensive throwing fouls. And you'll see here this language, not a sufficient basis for a foul. That's similar to the language that we've always had in the rules, and that's the language that we've used here within those receiving fouls. So it's not a new idea, this concept of a type of contact not being sufficient basis for a foul. We've just applied it to a different area than we had previously. No real key changes here other than what we've kind of raised before. But here in offsetting fouls, we've got just a clarity of language in the first little part about what we mean by these things, but the key thing here is in the second part around 17.9.2, we're saying that if there is that contact caused by two players moving towards the same point, so neither of them initiated the contact, it wasn't that one of them changed their line after the other and that's what caused the contact, it was that they were both moving towards the same point at the same time and they both jumped and they both bumped their shoulders, that's an offsetting foul. And so the disc goes back to the thrower. However, as we've got similar to the receiving fouls, we do take into account when that occurred relative to the outcome having been determined. So if there are two players moving towards the same point at the same time, neither of them initiating the contact, they're both moving legally, and they both jump, and one player manages to catch the disc, and then after that catch, they then bump shoulders, and one of them, gets bumped over, then that is an indirect foul, so it doesn't negate the block, as you can see here in 17.9.2.1. So similar to the receiving foul, we have kind of carved out this slight exception in terms of, when is it relevant to have that conversation of, but I got the disc first? That's not a valid reason for initiating the contact, but if it is that you are both causing the contact by both moving to the same point, you can say, well, actually, I think I got the block first, and then we had an offsetting foul, so therefore that is an indirect foul. You both moved towards the same point, you both caused that contact, the block had already occurred, and so it is deemed to be an indirect foul. But again, there's the exclusion for dangerous play. If it was dangerous, ignore all that. It's treated as a foul and can be treated as a receiving foul if it was involved with trying to catch the disc. All right, moving along now here to 18. Just change the wording slightly here to cover all instances of bad stall counts, starting the stall count in any way that's not correct. So just covered more bases there. 18.112 and 18.114, quite interconnected, and that's a change to how far we want the marker to be from the thrower. And this is in line with USAU rules. And so it used to just be that there was a line between the defensive player's feet that intersected or that contained the thrower's pivot point. But now we're saying it can't even, that's too close. You have to move a whole nother disc width back from that. So if you were used to being in a legal marking position with your feet, you're going to have to move a disc width back from that now to be legal, so that the thrower is going to have more space. But hopefully what that means is that there's less contact between the thrower and the marker, less instances of fouls called therefore between the thrower and the marker, and we think that's a good thing. So that's the change for both, that's the change for both straddle and for wrapping. We've added in that additional disc width with how far you have to be away from the marker and the thrower. So I think a really important thing for teams to practice, that we are ensuring that that marker is getting back away from the thrower. Any sort of wrapping around them is totally unacceptable, but even the straight arms, you have to be back a disc width away from their torso, the line between your arms. 18.1.2, we've again just got a clarification here that matches with the USAU change that they made recently, put in place. And that's that if you have got a marking infraction that's called and it's contested, what do you do about that if there's been a pass completed? Because marking infractions generally don't stop play, right? So, for example, the thrower calls straddle, right? The thrower calls straddle, and the marker hears straddle and goes, okay, well, I should, adjust and mark legally. And they look down at their feet to try and adjust, and they think, well, actually, a line between my feet is more than a disc width away from your pivot point. So I think it's an incorrect straddle call. But as they're looking down at their feet, the thrower then throws a completed pass past them, breaks them really easily because they weren't paying attention. And so as a result, if that was a contested marking infraction, or if it was retracted, if the thrower realizes actually, yes, that was the wrong call, I shouldn't have called straddle, this is treated as a violation by the offense, and the disc is returned to the thrower. So the thrower, one way to look at it, and again, we don't assume that people are intentionally breaking the rules, but the thrower can't use multiple calls of straddle disc-based wrapping, and regardless of whether they're correct or not, to distract the marker so that they can then make an easy pass. If there is a contested or retracted marking infraction, it's as if the offense has made a breach and the disc is returned to the thrower. Down here, 18.1.6, this is just a change to reflect the fact that it's not just the thrower who will be calling a marking infraction, because any offense player can call double team. And also the caveat referring there back to that rule I just spoke about, 18.121. And this rule that was deleted, that is being addressed by that additional rule under section 9 around multiple calls involving the thrower. And so that's covered elsewhere, so we could remove that rule. Moving down to travel, you see a few examples of that pivot point, location, spot, all that cleaned up within this section. But here we have a really significant change. It depends on how you've been playing previously or not, but it's to get us back in line with USAU in this regard. And that is in terms of the give-go play. This is the best way to describe it. It used to be that if you wanted to try and throw it, you're running, you catch it, and you wanted to get off a quick pass, you had to have been still slowing down in the previous rules and had to have a ground contact when you actually threw the disc. We've removed that limitation now, and you can throw while running or jumping. You can release the pass without reducing speed and without having a ground contact, as long as you do not change direction or increase speed, and that a maximum of 2 additional points of contact with the ground are made after the catch and before you releasing the pass. So you've got those 2 points of contact after the catch, additional points of contact before which you have to release the disc. And if you release it after that, as you'll see down here in 18252, that becomes a travel if you release it after those legally allowed number of ground contacts. So we are allowing those quicker give goes now. It was always a tricky thing to determine exactly how well we could determine as self-officiators whether they were slowing down, whether they did release it while they had a ground contact. And so now we've removed that requirement. It's just, did they release it prior to those 2 steps? They could be in the air, they could be maintaining speed, but they must still not increase speed and not change direction. We've got here 1823. We just provided some clarity around what we mean by pivot, and again, that's to do with those ideas of pivot location, pivot spot, pivot point clarified within that. 1824, just clarified the language there around standing up or not. No real change to the actual outcome there. It's just a clarification of the language. As we move down here, 18251, all we've done here is kind of bundled up a lot of the rules there. We actually kind of repeated a lot of the things from these paragraphs up here before in how we described what a travel infraction was. And so really all we're saying is if your pivot is not at the right spot, whether that's because you didn't reduce speed, because you changed direction, or because the pivot location was at a certain spot after a turnover or whatever, and you've gone to the wrong spot, that's all covered by 18251. And 18252 just reverts back to the give-go plays. 18253 is a clarification that I hadn't seen anyone trying to abuse previously, but we just wanted to close that loophole off before it became common practice. And that is that even though in WFDF you don't have to tap the disc to the ground after moving to the pivot location, as you do in USAU, we didn't still want that to mean that you could just like take a big run up and do as if you were pulling the disc when you're moving up to the pivot location. So this is saying that if you are moving to a specific spot, specific location, I should say, you need to make sure that you don't start your wind up or your throwing action until you actually have a pivot at that correct point, or at that spot. It might be the incorrect spot, in which case a travel could be called, but you can't start your wind up or your throwing action until you actually have a pivot point. 18255, just to clarify the wording there, and I think again just matching what USAU were doing there. No real change, I don't think, until how things are actually played within the rules, just some clarity around language. And again, those similar changes to point, spot, location, and accepted and uncontested. This is a change here to again match USAU, and that is that previously we said that you did have to stay stalling before you resume the stall count. Now you don't have to stay stalling. You still have to pause the stall count if there is this travel where the thrower hasn't released the disc. So the thrower has the frisbee, they go to fake and they travel. You call travel, you have to pause your stall count, but once they have their foot back at the correct spot, you can just continue stalling with the number rather than having to say the word stalling. So a change, but not a significant one. No changes to the pick. I think it's been a while since we've had no changes to the pick, and we're still always discussing and trying to work out what we can do to perhaps improve this rule. It's not always a perfect rule, but no changes for 2021 to 2024. Stoppages, we've changed to use the word safety stoppages because there are other forms of stoppages. These are specifically safety stoppages. And we've got here, we've shifted a few things down to different spots. It's no great deal. It's the change of possession and catch there. Just clarified here that the injury is not the result of a foul by an opponent. So if you've the one who've committed a foul and therefore been injured, that doesn't give you the right to stay on the field. Here, we've got two key changes here to be aware of. That's around what to do with bleeding or player with an open or bleeding wound. What we've said here is that what we want you to be doing is any player can call a stoppage because they think that someone has an open or bleeding wound. So anybody can do that, and I think that's important to allow that to occur. And we've also added in there that you can yell stop instead of technical, because that's what people yell anyway if there is that technical issue. In terms of the bleeding or open wound, we've then given a specific caveat that if, because it could be the opposition telling you that you've got blood and wanting you to stop play, we're actually meaning that you don't have to remove yourself from the field straight away. You can just address that issue. You've got 70 seconds to fix that up, bandage it up, clean it up, whatever it might be. And then you can just continue playing. You don't have to remove yourself from the field. But if you do need more time than that, then you will need to either be substituted or take a time out to allow you to address that. The other key part there then is that 19.2.1.1 is that we say that it's not just any player who can make these calls. It is only any player who can make the call, but it's not only any player who can be aware of this situation. And if you're on the sideline, as a coach, as a teammate, as an official, and this will generally apply to game advisors, and you see a dangerous situation, whether that is a child wandered onto the field, there is someone bleeding, you can alert players to that. You can't stop play because of that. You can alert players to that, because we want to do whatever we can to avoid that dangerous thing happening, and hopefully the players become aware, you're alerting them that, and they can then call the stoppage. So that's an important addition we've got in there. This has just been moved from a different spot. 19.2.2, 19.2.3 just added that clearly these issues here only apply when the disc is in the air. If it had stopped, then 19.2.3.1 and 19.2.3.2 don't apply. 19.3 just added faulty equipment as part of that, just to make sure that that's an allowable reason for calling a substitution. And also just really clear that if you are coming on the field and taking the place of someone, and that the reason that person is being subbed out is perhaps because they were fouled, you can call a foul. It's not just, if someone gets injured so much they're not able to call a foul, doesn't mean there wasn't a foul. The injured player, the substitute can call that foul on their behalf or contest the foul or whatever the case may be. Section 20 timeouts. Not too much has really changed within here. We've been able to remove a few things around survived ground contact because that's now covered by what we mean by established possession. We've removed the number of timeouts because that can be different in different levels of competition. So within WFDF events, that's now included within the appendix, the number of timeouts. Still the same for WFDF events, but just not in the rules. And just clarified here around that, you actually have to be stationary after the timeout. No one ever was not stationary, but wasn't explicit within the rules. And you can choose any spot to be able to establish that position as well. And here, as I spoke about, feels like a long time ago now, when we looked at some of those stall count issues, the stall count does now restart at maximum 9, whereas before it was just wherever you're up to plus 1 essentially. But if there's switch, again, as it always has been, it goes to stalling 1. And the last bit of a rule, we're going to look through the definitions, but the last bit of a rule is just in terms of 20.4, just been really clear that this idea of calling a timeout when you have none left and adding 2 only applies if you're calling it during live play. If there was a stoppage and you try and call it, you just say, oh, don't have any left. I don't call it anymore. And you can just resume play as you would have because there was already a stoppage. You haven't stopped play to call a timeout you didn't have, and that's why we're adding the 2 when that is the case. Some things just to highlight though within the definitions. We've removed some definitions. I won't go through all of those just because we think they're redundant. They're already covered somewhere else or they're no longer necessary. But again, here we see within call that idea of communicated rather than audible to match the idea that there might be different methods of communication. It doesn't have to only be audible. And included some more of those specific things that are calls. Here we have that definition of catch, and it is a really important thing to be aware of, that sense of it being trapped between at least 2 body parts. But we also then describe in further detail around what it means to maintain the catch, and that it means to continue to have a non-spinning disc trapped between at least 2 body parts. And if you don't maintain it, then that's a new catch when you do regain control. That doesn't mean it have to be the same 2 body parts. You could have it there and then let go of that, and that's okay. That's still, you've maintained the catch because there was no point within that where you didn't have it trapped. You just were able to swap the things that were trapped. So that's still maintaining the catch. And that, again, is really important when you're talking about where is it that you were when you caught the disc. Were you inbounds? Were you in the end zone? That's where it becomes critical about that sense of maintaining the catch or not. Goal line, just added some clarity there. Interception, established possession compared to catch. Here in legitimate position, we weren't quite happy with the way we defined that. It didn't quite meet all the situations we used it within the rules, so we kind of just adjusted the language to make it more applicable in every circumstance. And so it's both the stationary or the moving position of any player that's not in breach of any rules. There's lots of rules that describe when you might be in breach of how you're moving, but if you're not in breach of that, you are legitimately positioned. You are in a legitimate position, whether you're stationary or moving. Minor contact, again, as I highlighted previously, that's a really important adjustment. So make sure you're aware of that and using that language of minor contact. So it is reasonable grounds to contest a foul if you say, well, no, I think that the contact that I initiated was just minor contact. Perhaps that might be a violation if you think I did it on purpose or for whatever reason, but I don't think it constitutes a foul because it was just minimal physical force. I didn't alter your movements. I didn't alter your position. An example of that is you might lay out past someone to get a block and you just kind of like graze their hip as you do so. It didn't adjust their movements. It was just minimal. That would be minor contact, and that's the conversation you should be having around what you mean by minor contact as compared to the previous language where you would have referred to incidental contact. Hopefully one of the advantages there too is people seem to very easily kind of confuse accidental and incidental, and I would hope there's not going to be confusion between minor and accidental. Pivot. This is again in just keeping with many of those adjustments we looked at previously around pivot and pivot location as well. But we've also specified here, an important point here, that if a thrower has multiple options for a pivot point, the pivot point is not determined until they pivot. So if you want to pivot left-handed or right-handed, that's fine. If you've caught the disc and you've got 2 feet on the ground, you will determine your pivot once you actually pivot. And so that you have that freedom until that time to decide. But once you have pivoted, that's now your pivot point. People here, just to give clarity within the definitions, that if it is played with fewer than 14 players, that everyone is still considered a player. Possession here, as we've spoke about previously, this is the bit we've talked about already around what it means to establish possession of a pass, but there are other ways you can establish possession. You can also establish possession when you pick up the disc from the ground after a turnover, after a pull, after there's a stoppage, when you're just picking up the disc. That does establish possession. It doesn't have to just be of a pass, you establish possession, but it's once you actually have that control of it, that's when you have possession in those circumstances. And as we say here, once a player has possession, you can change your grip on it, you can adjust how you hold it, as long as you maintain contact with that disc, it's still that same possession, which is different from maintaining the catch. That's quite distinct wording there, but once you've gone through the process of maintaining the catch and you've established possession, then we're down to that next level of what you can do once you have possession. Pre-store, we've just added in what that actually means, and that impacts on 8.5 as we looked at previously. Those changes to the pool. And where the disc stops, again, just that shift to establish possession as compared to court. So I think that's it. If you've stuck through this whole thing, well done. You obviously show a keen interest in the rules. Hopefully found that interesting and useful to go and have a look through and understand what those changes are, and here's some of the rationale behind some of those changes. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I'm always happy to try and answer questions about the rules. So please don't hesitate to do that. You can find me if you contact through the rules, contacts there on rules.wfdf.sport. That'll come straight to me. And look out for the other resources out there to help better understand the rules, and hopefully use the knowledge you've gained here to share with other people so they can all better understand the rules, because I think that's an important responsibility that we all have. So thanks everybody for listening to me today.